He's a top U.S. economist and senior advisor to the White House. He says monetary easing of the United States is risky and that the government should rather focus on cutting its fiscal deficit. Join us this week as Ray Cheng-gang sits down with Martin Feldstein, only on Biz Talk. The U.S. Federal Reserve exerts huge influence on the world's #1 economy, as well as across the globe. In January 2006, Alan Greenspan, who served at the helm of the Monetary Authority for 18 years, retired from the top post. Martin Feldstein and Ben Bernanke led a neck-to-neck race to fill the vacancy. Then 67-year-old Feldstein seemed to be winning the battle. An established scholar and a 1977 laureate of the John Bates Clark Medal, a prize awarded every 2 years to outstanding young economists, Feldstein had also been a longtime prominent economic advisor to the White House. However, Bernanke ended up snapping up the job, a result many observers attribute to Feldstein's board membership of AIG. The insurer was then entangled in accounting fraud allegations, though Feldstein was not explicitly linked. After taking office, Bernanke was faced with a raging financial tsunami, which took a heavy toll on the U.S. economy. He rolled out unprecedented, unlimited monetary easing policies in an attempt to boost the weakening economy. This unconventional stance has won Ben Bernanke both accolades as well as criticism. As Bernanke's former competitor for the Fed chairmanship, how does Feldstein see the Fed chief's monetary policies right now?
Professor Feldstein, it's a pleasure having you with us again.
Nice being with you again.
So what would you say about his legacy, Bernanke's legacy?
Well, I think his main contribution was how he handled the crisis. And I think there was no rule book. It was certainly not what he expected when he came in. So I think from that point of view, what he did was very good. I think the so-called unconventional monetary policy, the long-term bond purchases and long-term mortgage-backed security purchases is putting great risks on the economy.
So what would you do differently if you were the chairman of the Federal Reserve?
I would say, I can't fix this problem. You have to fix it, Mr. President. You have to fix it, Mr. Congress. Fiscal deficit is a very large part of the problem. It deters businesses from investing. They're not sure what's going to happen next.
How would you explain the current euphoria, almost euphoria again, in the U.S. stock markets?
Federal Reserve. The Fed has promised to keep short-term rates at about 0, to keep long-term rates low. Ben Bernanke said he was trying to get the stock market to go up so that people would feel wealthier. And if they felt wealthier, they would spend more. If they spent more, that would get the economy moving. And I think the logic of that is correct. He also succeeded in getting the stock market up. But quantitatively, it turns out not to have been enough and it couldn't have been expected to be enough to really move the economy.
But you're not in favor of artificially low interest rate?
The unconventional policy of bond buying and exceptionally low long-term interest rates is building up several problems for the future.
The President of the United States can only serve for a maximum of 2 terms, but their economic advisors in the meantime can stay in the top ranks of policymaking for the long run. Feldstein is one of them. From Reagan to Obama, Feldstein has served as advisor to 5 U.S. presidents. In 1981, Reagan appointed Feldstein as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, which is also a talent pool for top U.S. economic technocrats. Greenspan and Bernanke have both chaired this commission. The appointment came as the U.S. economy was suffering the most severe stagflation since the Great Depression of 1929, with inflation rates and jobless rates both exceeding 10%. Feldstein was tasked with a tough challenge to find a cure to the economic illness. His performance did not disappoint. His proposed reforms, such as cutting the massive deficit or relaxing economic controls, paved the way for an economic prosperity that lasted for more than 20 years.
Were there any important facts or moments that you missed as head of President Reagan's economic team?
Things that in retrospect they should have done?
That you would have done differently?
I think one very key issue was Social Security reform. And there was a compromise plan that was put in place. Some people optimistically thought this was going to solve the problem for 75 years into the future, but they didn't do that. So that was a missed opportunity.
How different things would have been if you had...
Well, we wouldn't be looking at the long-term fiscal deficits.
Yeah. You've served presidents. Were there any moments of truth or moments of important decisions that you think would be worthy of Obama's time to re-examine and learn from those?
Well, I worked very closely with President Reagan. I was his chief economic advisor, and I was full-time in the White House at that time. During the years that I served, we always had a plan that brought us back to a balanced budget at the end of 5 years. Not 10 years, not forever, 5 years. That was another important kind of decision. One of the best things that President Reagan did was the major tax reform that occurred in 1986, dramatically reducing tax rates and broadening the tax base. So there are a lot of lessons there. I would say that the latter one, how to use tax reform to reduce tax rates, and in the current context also to reduce the deficit, is something that President Obama ought to be looking at.
Many regard Ronald Reagan as one of the greatest presidents in U.S. history. He put an end to the country's decade-long stagflation and kick-started an economic boom which lasted the following 2 decades. Some people say that current U.S. President Barack Obama could use Reagan as a role model. Despite their many differences, some media have also spotted similarities between the two. Both are charismatic politicians, skilled speakers, and communicators. They both won the presidency promising change, and both faced staggering economic woes when taking office. However, as many point out, Obama faces a new and even more complex environment, stalemate in congressional budgetary talks, and an increasingly multipolar world. The New York Times says it's a different world now for the new generation at the White House, as U.S. dominance on the global scene is weakening, and the president's view of America's role on the world stage is, quote, more modest and downbeat than the one held by his predecessors. How will history judge the U.S. president, who has already served 1 term and has another 4 years to bring about change?
He has a choice of 2. Either he will be as uncompromising as he can be and continue fight with the Republicans and get nothing done. Alternatively, he may choose to compromise with the Republicans and get something done so that there will be an impressive Obama legacy. Which one would you think will be the more likely?
He'll wait. He'll try to look like the problem is the Republicans, try to persuade the American public at that time. If enough Democrats get to replace Republicans in the House, then he'll have 2 years in which he will control, his party will control both houses as well as the White House. And then he doesn't have to compromise. He doesn't have to compromise, at least with the Republicans. He has to work out a deal with the Democrats. And so I think that is his current game plan. What exactly he would do with it at that time, we can only get a hint from the kind of budget that has been put forward by the Senate Democrats. And it's not a very impressive one. Instead of saying, well, we're going to significantly lower the fiscal deficit, start bringing the debt to GDP ratio down, they say, here's our plan, and if it's enacted, it will simply stabilize the very high ratio of debt to GDP.
But is it fair to say that in 3 to 4 years of time, when you look back at President Obama, you would say, regardless of what people say about him in history books, he has not been a president that's given Americans a good economy?
That's certainly true. That's certainly true. I mean, there is no plan for economic growth. They enacted, as you know, in the beginning of 2009, a large so-called stimulus package. It was very badly designed, so you ended up with adding almost $1 trillion to the national debt, including the accumulating interest, adding almost $1 trillion with very little increase in economic activity, because so much of that money was transfers to local governments and other things that had very little impact.
So you are disappointed at his performance?
Now, disappointed means that I had higher expectations.
You never had high expectations?
I never had very high expectations, although the team of economists who he had with him was very good. So I had high expectations that they would give him advice and that he would take the advice. But maybe he didn't take the advice.
He's a top U.S. economist and senior advisor to the White House. He says monetary easing of the United States is risky and that the government should rather focus on cutting its fiscal deficit. Join us this week as Rui Chenggang sits down with Martin Feldstein, only on Biz Talk. In Europe, a banking sector crisis seems to be resurfacing. At the epicenter of the downturn is Cyprus, a country accounting for only 0.2% of the Eurozone's total economic output. As part of the conditions for its international bailout for troubled banks, the Cypriot government decided in mid-March to impose an unprecedented levy on depositors. Though the move was later rejected by the country's lawmakers, it sent shockwaves throughout the entire market, unnerving depositors as well as investors. Many commentators warned the proposed deposit grab has the potential to trigger a full-scale bank run across the Eurozone and threaten the existence of the euro as a common currency. Some economists even go a step further and suggest peripheral countries like Cyprus and Greece actually quit the single currency bloc in order to devaluate their currencies and thereby boost their export sector and competitiveness. Since the founding of the European Coal and Steel Community back in 1952, efforts for greater European integration has proceeded for more than 6 decades. Despite wars and conflicts, the majority of Europeans are actually dreaming of a unified bloc in order to ensure peace and prosperity. Now at a crossroads facing tough decisions, what should they opt for?
But there seems to be still a lot of doubts cast upon the situation in Cyprus.
So I don't think the worst part of it is over. I was much more optimistic, say, 2 months ago. I think what's happened in Cyprus, no matter how it finally gets resolved, the very fact that the idea of bailing in, as they say, the depositors, turning to the depositors and taxing away some of their deposits, sets a precedent that will disturb Europeans who make bank deposits. Do you want to make a deposit in a Spanish or an Italian bank when the country may say, well, now we're going to call on you to help solve the local fiscal deficit by taking away some of your deposits? So I think that was a big mistake to go down that route.
Maybe we'll see people in Cyprus flooding into banks to withdraw cash.
Yes, but of course that's already happened. I mean, they will already have taken whatever loss is finally agreed to. But it's not just Cyprus. If this were a Cyprus-only problem, it wouldn't matter. It's that once you've invented a remedy like this, it's hard to unvent it or to make people forget that it's an option that the politicians might turn to.
Would you also consider what's happening in Brussels a political crisis? Because Sarkozy told us that the whatever decision that's made in Brussels is always a few months late.
Brussels has made one decision after another in the name of strengthening political union, and they have congratulated themselves on a fiscal compact, on a banking union, on other arrangements. which in my judgment are pretty empty, really haven't accomplished anything.
Would be the ideal situation, if you were to advise?
Well, they made a mistake. That's the problem. They made a mistake when they started this. The attempt to put all these countries with different economic conditions, different habits, into a single currency, I think was a mistake. I don't think they're going to give it up easily. Or
they won't. They will tell you, Professor Feldstein, this is a peace project. You can't just examine it through...
Yeah, they did say that, and there may have been some truth to that 20 years ago when they first started talking about a United States of Europe, but it isn't that anymore. Nobody's worried that Germany is going to invade France, so it's not a peace project; it's a political project.
But if you interview people out there in Europe, they will tell you we cannot go back because we're used to working in Germany and living in France.
Well, they could do all that, but they don't have to have a single currency. Single currency certainly isn't necessary for that. So people work in London and they're Germans or French or Italians. They use British pounds, not euros, for doing it. So the idea that you needed a single currency I think was, in order to make the European Union work, was never very persuasive.
The business leaders would also argue that for Europe to compete with emerging economies such as China, Brazil, or the United States, the most powerful economy, Europe has to unite as one. And having a single currency improves the efficiency and boost the competitiveness.
Sure isn't doing it very well, is it? I mean, it's a mess. The economies are contracting. The existence of the euro allowed countries to build up large amounts of debt. The markets didn't quite understand that in the end this was a very risky situation. It may mean that for some of the countries in the periphery, Greece, Cyprus, Portugal, they may conclude that they would be better being outside the euro, where they could devalue their currency and become more competitive and get back to growing.
For the economy of any country, its real estate market is undoubtedly a crucial component. Home prices catch news headlines and dominate conversations at the dinner table. But this hot topic is also one of the most risky. In the United States, owning a property is part of the American dream. But over the past decades, the real estate sector has often more harmed than helped the country's economy. The 2008 financial downturn, which raged across the globe, stemmed from the subprime debt crisis in the U.S. Across the Pacific, in the world's second largest economy, China, the real estate market there looks even more popular, but also controversial. Over the past several years, skyrocketing home prices in China have prompted the central government to roll out curbing measures in order to cool down the market.
We have a lot of mandatory measures employed in China. Are you more in favor of increasing the transactional tax or the tax that you pay when you are keeping the house?
Well, I think as a revenue source, having a tax that you pay, a real estate property tax, would be a good thing. It will be a source of revenue for local governments, and that a property tax, and that would solve some of the problems of the local governments here.
But you're not particularly in favor of increasing the tax at the transaction level of the...
Reduces the mobility of the population. Somebody who has, I don't know exactly how this tax would be implemented, but if every time you sold you had to pay a significant tax, then it would slow down the ability of people to move.
And mobility is very important to the health of the economy.
It always is.
And also, people are talking about the 20% transaction tax, very high tax.
Yes, we've had a gain tax like that. If you reinvest those funds in another house, you don't have to pay the tax. So it's only when you finally leave housing, become a renter instead of an owner, that you would have to pay the capital gains tax on the appreciation of house prices.
Is that big, 20%?
That's about the kind of number that an American homeowner would face also.
Currently, the property prices in cities like Beijing and even in some second-tier cities is comparable to those of the United States. And some say it's, if you think about the mortgage at the banks, it's worrisome. It's a worrisome situation. It might give us some banking troubles or financial woes in the long run.
Well, it certainly did in the United States. I mean, a major reason for the economic downturn and for the very slow recovery was what had happened in the real estate market, where house prices fell very sharply after being way above any kind of sustainable level. And even today, even with house prices beginning to come back in the United States, still 1 out of every 4 homes with a mortgage, the size of the mortgage exceeds the value of the home. So it's a serious problem.